全員先輩と同じタイプか。
Nobody teaches you to disappear. You figure it out on your own. You learn which needs to mention and which ones to bury. You learn which feelings are acceptable and which ones make people uncomfortable. You learn that the easiest version of you is the smallest version. And one day, small stops feeling like a sacrifice. It just feels like you. Megumi Fushiguro's name literally means grace or blessing. His father named him that, and then left him. Toji Fushiguro was not a father. He was a man who had a child the way some people have furniture, something that was there, something he didn't particularly need. Megumi's mother died shortly after he was born. His father, already unstable, already disappearing back into violence for money, remarried, gave Megumi a stepsister, Tsumiki, and then vanished completely when Gojo ended him in battle. At the age when most children are learning how to want things, Megumi learned something different. He learned that the people who are supposed to stay don't. Psychologists have a name for what this does to a child's developing brain. They call it attachment disruption. When early caregivers disappear, through death, abandonment, neglect, the child doesn't just feel sad. Their nervous system rewrites its operating code. The new code says, needing people is dangerous. Needing people gets you left. And so a child does what children always do. They adapt. They stop needing things out loud. They decide, not consciously, not in one moment, that the safest version of themselves is the version that wants the least. Gojo found Megumi at age 8, bought him, literally, out of a binding obligation to the Zenin clan, gave him a future, a path, a school. But Gojo couldn't undo what the first 8 years had already installed. No one can. I want you to stop for a second. Because what I just described, a child who learned that needing people is a liability, that is not a rare psychological condition. Research consistently shows that roughly 1 in 5 adults across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia identifies with avoidant attachment, the pattern that forms when early relationships teach us that vulnerability gets punished. 1 in 5, and that is only the people who can name it. Think about your own life. Was there a moment, maybe you can't place exactly when, where you stopped asking for certain things? Where you stopped mentioning when something hurt? Where you started answering, "I'm fine," before the question was even finished? That is not maturity. That is the same code Megumi's brain wrote. And it started the same way his did, with someone who was supposed to stay, who didn't. Here is what makes Megumi Fushiguro psychologically unique, and what makes him so dangerous to study if you see yourself in him. He built a philosophy around his wound. Most people who disappear quietly. They just stop showing up for themselves. No explanation, no framework. Megumi did something more sophisticated. He constructed a moral code that made self-erasure look like virtue. That line, that one line, that is the most psychologically revealing sentence in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. And almost no one talks about what it actually means. Read it again. The world is full of people besides myself. He is not saying he values others. He is saying that he, Megumi Fushiguro, is the one who doesn't count. He is the exception. He is the one who can be subtracted. Psychologists call this self-concept diminishment. It is not humility. It is a core belief, formed in early childhood, that your own existence has less inherent value than the existence of others. And here is what makes it so insidious. From the outside, it looks noble. People who erase themselves often get called selfless, devoted, strong. No one looks at Megumi and says, "That boy doesn't believe he has the right to want things." They say, "He's a good sorcerer. He's reliable." They mistake the wound for the virtue. Look at his signature technique. When Megumi is losing, when the situation becomes impossible, he reaches for Maharaga, a shikigami that has never been tamed, a summoning that, by his own admission, means certain death. He doesn't reach for it as a last-ditch gamble the way a fighter might. He reaches for it as a trade, his life, for the problem going away. That is not a battle tactic. That is a man who has calculated his own life as a fair exchange for other people's outcomes. The researchers who study moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from participating in or witnessing actions that violate your own values, have found something consistent. The people most likely to use themselves as expendable resources are not the people with the least self-worth in an obvious way. They are the people who have built their identity entirely around being useful to others. When your entire reason for existing is your function, your ability to protect, to help, to fix, then your life outside of that function feels like a waste of space. You might not have a Maharaga, but you might have a version of the same trade. The way you stay at jobs that drain you because you don't want to let the team down. The way you keep giving to people who've stopped giving back because your need to be needed is stronger than your need to be okay. The way you volunteer for the hard thing, the painful thing, the thing no one else wants to carry, not because you want to, but because being the one who carries it gives you a reason to exist in the room. That is Megumi's trade, dressed in different clothes, and if you've been doing it long enough, you've probably stopped noticing it too. Megumi's stepsister Tsumiki is one of the most important characters in Jujutsu Kaisen, not because of her power or her role in the plot, but because of what she represents in Megumi's psychological architecture. She is the reason he gets to exist. Understand what I mean by that. After his father left, after his mother was already gone, after he learned that the world does not hold space for Megumi Fushiguro's needs, Tsumiki gave him a function. He would protect her. He would become strong enough to protect her. His life had a purpose, not because he mattered as a person, but because she needed someone to stand between her and harm. Psychologists who specialize in childhood trauma call this conditional existence. It is the belief, not thought, not said out loud, just felt in the bones, that you are allowed to be here only as long as you are performing a function. You are allowed to exist as the protector. You are allowed to exist as the reliable one. You are allowed to exist as the one who doesn't complain. The moment that function ends, the moment you are no longer needed, the question underneath all the silence comes back. If I'm not here to protect anyone, what am I here for? When Tsumiki is struck by a mysterious curse and goes into a coma, Megumi doesn't grieve in the way you might expect. He accelerates. He pushes harder, fights more recklessly, takes on more weight, because grief, real, sitting still grief, would require him to acknowledge that he needed her, and needing someone is the first step to being left by them. So, instead of grieving, he turns the grief into fuel. He turns the wound into a mission. Psychologists call this trauma-driven purpose. It is the pattern where a person converts their deepest pain into their most relentless drive, not to heal it, but to outrun it. It produces extraordinary performance. It produces terrible damage, and then comes the cruelest moment in his entire arc. Tsumiki dies, not in battle, not protecting him, not in a way that makes sense. She is taken, her body, her consciousness, her entire self, used as a vessel by a god who treats human lives as furniture, the same way Toji treated Megumi. History doesn't repeat itself in Megumi's life. It performs the same surgery twice. I want you to understand what that stillness means. Megumi does not collapse. He does not scream. He does not allow himself a single visible moment of falling apart. Because falling apart would mean admitting that Tsumiki wasn't just someone he protected. She was the only proof he had that he was worth protecting something. When she dies, not just in body, but by having her identity erased, herself consumed, Megumi loses the last external justification for his own existence. The one person whose presence said, "You matter because you protect me," gone. And Megumi, the boy who already believed he didn't count, now has nothing left to point to. No function, no reason, just the unbearable weight of existing without a purpose to justify it. Sukuna doesn't choose Megumi's body randomly. He chooses it because Megumi's spirit is already fractured. Because a boy who has spent his entire life making himself small, who has spent years treating himself as a currency to be spent, has left the door open. The possession isn't a supernatural attack. It is the logical conclusion of a life spent disappearing. You cannot be possessed when you know who you are. You can only be taken when you've already started to leave. I need to ask you something directly. Is there a person in your life, or a role, a job, a relationship, that you use the way Megumi used Tsumiki? Not a person you love, a purpose you use to justify your existence, the project that makes you feel like you're allowed to take up space, the friendship where you're always the one fixing things. Because if you stop fixing, you don't know what you are to them. The relationship you stay in, not because it's good, but because being needed is the only place where you feel real. Research into conditional self-worth, worth that depends entirely on performance or usefulness to others, shows a brutal pattern. People who tie their existence to their function don't leave situations that harm them, not because they can't see the harm, because leaving would require them to believe they deserve something better. And that's the belief that never got installed. There is a version of Megumi that most people misread. The coldness, the detachment, the way he calculates situations that other people feel, the way he can look at human suffering as a strategic variable. Most fans read this as strength, as intelligence, as his INTJ or ISTJ type if you follow the personality typing communities online. That reading misses the psychology entirely. What Megumi practices is not authentic detachment. It is emotional compartmentalization, a defense mechanism where a person separates their feelings from their decisions so thoroughly that they begin to experience themselves as if they have no feelings at all. It is not that Megumi doesn't feel. It is that feeling, in his experience, has always preceded loss. He felt connected to his father. His father left. He felt safe in his small family. That was taken. He felt needed by Tsumiki. She was taken too. The pattern that his nervous system extracts from that evidence is consistent and brutal. Feeling leads to attachment. Attachment leads to loss. Loss is the most painful thing that exists. Therefore, stop feeling. The clinical term for this in psychology is experiential avoidance. And the research on it is consistent across decades, Shutting off your emotions doesn't protect you from suffering. It removes your ability to detect it early enough to do something about it. Your emotions are data. They tell you when something is wrong, when someone is taking too much, when a situation is costing you more than it gives back. When you shut them off, when you become Megumi, calculating everything, feeling nothing at the surface, you lose your early warning system. You stay in situations that are hurting you, because you can't feel the hurt clearly enough to know it's hurting. And yet, despite all of it, despite the philosophy of self-erasure, despite the coldness, despite treating his own life as expendable currency, Megumi cannot help connecting. Yuji breaks through, Nobara breaks through, even Gojo, in his chaotic, boundary-violating way, breaks through. Because here is the thing about people who disappear. They never wanted to. They just learned that wanting to stay was too dangerous. Okay, I want to be direct with you right now. The people who watch videos like this, who find themselves in characters like Megumi, are usually one of two types. Type 1. You know exactly which part of yourself you've made small. You know what you've stopped asking for, what you've stopped saying out loud. You've been doing it so long that you've stopped noticing the cost. But some part of you is keeping count. You watched Megumi just now, and something in you said, yes, not in a fandom way, in a recognition way. Type 2. You're watching this and you're thinking, I'm not like that. I don't erase myself. I'm fine. And that thought arrived a little too quickly, a little too ready, because people who have genuinely made peace with themselves don't need to say it that fast. Psychologists who study self-abandonment describe a consistent pattern. The deeper the erasure, the less visible it is to the person living inside it. Not because they're in denial, because it has been present since before they had language to name it. You don't feel small, you feel normal, and that feeling of normalcy is exactly the problem. I want to talk about Megumi's cursed technique for a moment, not as a battle analysis, but as a psychological metaphor, because Gege Akutami did something genius here. The Ten Shadows technique requires Megumi to summon divine beasts, Shikigami, from his own shadow, from his own darkness. Think about that. His power does not come from light. It does not come from speed, or raw force, or an inherited solar energy like the Six Eyes. His power comes from shadow, from what is hidden, from what most people turn away from the parts of himself he has never let anyone see. And the most powerful entity in his entire arsenal, Mahoraga, is the one that has never been tamed, the one that even Sukuna, the king of curses, respects, the one that Megumi reaches for when he is willing to die. There is a moment, one of the most psychologically rich moments in the entire series, when Megumi, facing an impossible battle, almost summons Mahoraga again, his death wish rising, his old code activating. You are the currency, spend yourself, solve the problem. And then he stops. He remembers Gojo's words. He does something he has almost never done in his entire life. He chooses himself. He stops trying to be a proper sorcerer. He stops trying to die correctly. He lets the chaos out. He unleashes the domain. He laughs, not because it's funny, but because he has finally, for one moment, stopped making himself small enough to be manageable. Clinical psychologist Carl Jung called this the shadow self, the parts of our psyche we suppress because they have been deemed unacceptable, the anger you don't let yourself feel, the ambition you've buried because you decided you didn't deserve it, the part of you that knows your needs matter and that you have spent years training to stay quiet. The reason Megumi's power comes from shadow is not an accident. It is the series telling you, the parts of yourself you have made small, the parts you have buried, suppressed, dismissed, that is where your actual power lives. You are not too much. You are too compressed. What happens to Megumi in the Culling Game arc is, on the surface, a supernatural event. Sukuna, the most powerful cursed spirit in existence, takes over his body completely. Megumi becomes a vessel. He is present, but absent. His body acts, but he is not acting. His hands move, but they are not his. For a while, for a painfully long while, Megumi simply stops existing. I want you to think about what the series is saying with this, because Sukuna did not possess Yuji in the same way. Yuji, for all his own self-sacrificial instincts, fights back. He screams from inside. He resists. He is loud about his own presence even when trapped. Megumi, who has spent his entire life making himself smaller, quieter, less present, does not resist in the same way, because a person who has practiced disappearing cannot find the grip to hold on. Psychologists who work with dissociation, the clinical experience of feeling absent from your own life, your own body, your own story, describe it as the endpoint of long-term self-abandonment. You don't dissociate suddenly, you drift, a little quieter each year, a little less certain what you actually want, a little less able to distinguish between your own voice and the voices of people who told you what you should be. Until one day someone asks you what you want, genuinely asks like they care, and you feel the question land in empty space. You don't know. Not because you're broken, because you trained yourself to stop listening. But here is what the series refuses to let die. Even inside the possession, even inside the total surrender, Megumi's will persists. It is small. It is barely there. It is a single note in silence. But it does not disappear completely. The manga shows us Megumi's soul, still present, still flickering, expressing the desire to live for others once more. Not gone, not extinguished, still there. Because the truth about people who have made themselves small is this: the self they buried never actually died. It just learned to wait. Right now, I want you to hear something. If you have been disappearing, if you have been making yourself small because it felt safer, because needing things got you hurt, because the people who were supposed to stay left, because you built your worth around your function and not your existence, I am not going to tell you to fix it today. I am not going to give you a 3-step system. What I want to say is simpler than that. The part of you that knows you've been doing this, the part that recognized itself in Megumi, that part is not a problem to be managed. That is your shadow. That is the most honest thing about you. And the fact that you're still here, still watching, still trying to understand yourself, means the candle hasn't gone out. It just needs someone to see it. When Yuji finally reaches Megumi, pulls him back from whatever internal void the possession had reduced him to, the conversation between them is, by design, simple. Megumi says he wanted to protect Tsumiki, to preserve the normal life they used to have. That life is gone. Tsumiki is gone. And yet, for the first time, Megumi doesn't follow that acknowledgement with a trade. He doesn't say, I'll find a new function. I'll find a new reason to justify existing. He says, in the only way his personality allows for, something close to, I'm still here. Psychologists who study recovery from self-abandonment syndrome, the pattern of chronic self-erasure that develops from early attachment disruption, describe the first stage of healing not as joy, not as sudden self-love, not as confidence. They describe it as sitting still long enough to notice what you actually feel. That's it. Not fixing it, not performing recovery, not having a revelation, just stopping the constant self-management long enough to notice there's a person under there. Megumi has not healed by the end of JJK. That would be dishonest to the reality of how deep his pattern runs. But he has stopped, even briefly, treating himself as the one who doesn't count. He has let Yuji in. He has let the connection exist without immediately converting it into a function. And that, for someone like Megumi, is the most radical act in the entire series. I want to name something for you before this video ends. If you grew up being told, not in words but in experience, that your needs were a burden, if you learned to read rooms before entering them, to make yourself acceptable before being present, if you've spent years being the reliable one, the low-maintenance one, the one people come to but never worry about, you are carrying Megumi's code. And it is not a character flaw. It is a survival adaptation that worked. Past tense. It worked when you were small, when the people around you were unpredictable, when needing too much meant being left. It does not work now, because you are not small anymore, and the people in your life right now, the ones worth having, are not going to leave because you need something. But you won't know that until you test it, and you won't test it until you believe, even slightly, that you have the right to. Jujutsu Kaisen is, on the surface, a story about curses and sorcerers and incomprehensible power. But underneath every battle, every domain expansion, every sacrifice, it is a story about what happens when people are not allowed to take up their full amount of space. Gojo performs himself into a corner so high no one can reach him. Think about what Gojo actually is, beneath the blindfold, beneath the smile, beneath the I'm the strongest, that he says so often it starts to sound less like confidence and more like a script he memorized. Gojo Satoru is a man who learned, very early, that being extraordinary was the only way to be safe. That if you are powerful enough, untouchable enough, no one can get close enough to hurt you. So he made himself into a performance. He performed strength so convincingly that people stopped asking if he was okay. They stopped checking. Because you don't check on the strongest person in the room. Megumi erases himself so thoroughly he almost disappears. Two different strategies, the same wound underneath. Gojo. I will be so much that no one can reach me. Megumi. I will be so little that no one needs to. Both are the same belief, that who you actually are is not acceptable, that you have to become something else to be allowed to exist. The opposite of what Megumi does is not pride. It is not ego. It is not becoming Gojo, building a performance so impenetrable that even the people who love you can't find the door. It is simply being present, taking up the space your body actually occupies, letting your needs be real instead of inconvenient, letting the people who say they care actually care. Megumi Fushiguro spent most of his life believing that his job was to be useful enough to justify being here. What Jujutsu Kaisen slowly, painfully argues, through every loss, every fracture, every possession and return, is that he was allowed to be here anyway. Not because of the 10 shadows, not because of his potential, not because Gojo saw something in him, just because he was here. And so are you. Why you made yourself small. It's not a flaw. It's a story. A story that started before you could understand it. A story that convinced you the safest version of you was the smallest version. But Megumi Fushiguro, after everything, came back. Not because the pain was gone, not because the losses were reversed, not because he suddenly believed he mattered, but because the flicker was still there, because the shadow never fully went out. If you recognized yourself in this video, not the sorcerer part, not the curses, but the quiet part, the part that stopped asking, that part is still there. Leave a comment. Tell me, what's one thing you stopped asking for? I genuinely want to know. And if someone in your life is doing this, making themselves small, being the one who never seems to need anything, send this to them. They might not say it, but they need to know the candle hasn't gone out. I'll see you in the next one.